Hello, everyone. Welcome to FRAC 2020-2021. Our next presentation is breaking down a standard of sponsored research agreement by James Casey, Esquire. James Casey is an eDiscovery attorney, certified privacy practitioner, and adjunct associate professor in the CUNY Research Administration and Compliance Program. Jim has negotiated a wide range of contracts over 20 plus years within academia, law, and local government, and is passionate about contracting in the university industry and international realms. He has received the Incura Distinguished Service Award in 2009 and is the State Bar of Wisconsin delegate to the American Bar Association House of Delegates. Can we start our next slide, please?
Yes, please. Thank you, Tamaria, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, talk to you about a template-sponsored research agreement, what is in them, how you want to negotiate them, and how all the parts fit together. And what I will be doing today is going through a sponsored research agreement, and then at the end having enough time for questions. So please hold your questions to the end, and I'll be happy to take as many of those as time will allow. And of course, after the session, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at either email address in the PowerPoint presentation or in the contract. My email address is both business and at CUNY are there, and I'd be happy to respond. So really what we're talking about today is, deconstructing a contract. What I've learned over many years in contract negotiation is that the best ways of learning contracting is by doing. And in a session like this, it's I think most useful instead of talking in theoretical levels to go into a actual contract and deconstruct it and talk through it as you go through it. And there's a couple of assumptions up front that I will raise right now. And of course, that hopefully applies to your institution, but maybe it doesn't. But, this, session assumes that your entity or your university or research institute has a clear process of contracting. It also assumes that the staff that negotiate these contracts have opportunities for professional development. Now, obviously, in a pandemic time, there's many no-cost professional development opportunities available. In the old days, as I would like to say, some of the best ones were at conferences which required travel budgets. But the pandemic is changing many things in the research administration world, as well as the professional world and beyond. So there's really a lot of opportunities now to become much better skilled at contracting without spending a lot of money doing it. It will remain to see what happens after the pandemic and parts of the old world come back into play. But in the offices I have managed and directed over the years, I always put a key prime emphasis upon professional development opportunity for all the staff, but certainly contracting individuals in particular. The presentation today also assumes that your institution has a clear institutional signature policy. Who may sign contracts? What types of contracts? Are your industry contracts negotiated by your sponsor research office, or are they signed by your intellectual property or technology transfer office? Are your non-disclosure agreements signed by your sponsor research office, or are they signed by your tech transfer office? These sort of questions are critical, and as I have just said, I hope that all of that is clear at your institution, but I can tell you from one instance during my professional career when I set up a contracts office, we had problems over the preceding couple years with development officers negotiating non-disclosure agreements. And that was a problem because A, they were not skilled in the area of NDAs, nor were they contract negotiators because they were fundraisers. So coming to that institution, of course, I had to do some dirty work, which is notifying certain other parties that the contracts that were signed were not valid because the individuals in development did not have authority to sign those contracts. So once again, I hope you don't run into that a whole lot, and I hope at your current institutions you do not, but that possibility does exist. And as some of you may already know, you have faculty at varying types of institutions that sign contracts because, well, they're the PI of the technical part of the project, but they don't necessarily have a signature authority. And certainly many university officers, such as deans, generally do not have signature authority. So these are the this is something I assume it's all clear and understood and appropriate, but it is something just to keep in mind as you execute your job. Another bullet point you'll see here before we get to the contract itself is my firm belief that contract negotiators should find reasons to say yes to sponsored projects and not no. In other words, they should facilitate. Now, that may seem like a common sense point to make, but the reality is that some contract negotiators are overly bureaucratic or lawyerly or semi-lawyerly in their approach, and that may rub the faculty the wrong way. And you know, we contract negotiators are a support function to the faculty. Clearly, we would never do anything that is illegal or against university policy. But there are gray areas in contract negotiation. And oftentimes, like in the last bullet point here, sometimes signing certain contracts are a business decision. And sometimes those do need to go up the chain of command once the contract has been appropriately negotiated with all the appropriate language and clauses and that sort of thing. So keep in mind that the whole discussion of what is in the contract itself, clause-wise, is separate from the discussion of business decisions to sign. I would tell you right away that I had one case in my career involving a certain Chinese telecommunications company, and that contract was negotiated by myself over a Christmas holiday, but because it involved this Chinese company and it attracted the attention of a local FBI branch, we had to take it all the way to the university president to make the business decision to sign. So, you know, in my role as a director or AVP, you'd make a recommendation to sign, but sometimes there's a business decision for very specialized areas. And for the group here today, that's just something to keep in mind. So the contract legal language is a separate issue from the business decision to sign. Another point I would like to make, contract negotiators are generally not lawyers for the university or the institution. Do not hold yourself out as a lawyer in any way, shape, or form, unless you're in the Office of General Counsel at your institution. And that is a gray area, because in the case of myself, I was a practicing lawyer and licensed for several years before I went into research administration. So I always had faculty at each school saying, well, Jim Casey's my lawyer. And he'd tell that to the companies, and I'd be like, no, I'm not your lawyer. I am your advocate and the research administrator helping you to get to yes. So keep all these points in mind. And with that, we'll turn over to the contract itself, so we can move on to the other document. So while the screen is being adjusted, let me start off by talking about at the top of the contract. The contract, and from my own practice and experience as a lawyer, has always been to be as detailed as possible within the contract. And that starts off right at the top of the contract. And once the contract comes back up online, I will be able to illustrate it more. But certainly near the top of the contract, you should have the title of the project. And below that, if it is federal flow down provisions, you would want the appropriate language from the prime award put into the sponsored research agreement, if that is applicable. What you'll find with a lot of standard contracts is that they are meant to be within certain parameters altered. Now, if you're at a public university, for those of you online today about public university contracts, there are issues either as far as legislation goes or administrative rules within the state or court decisions that have a bearing on what types of contracts clauses would be acceptable at your public university. So that is certainly something to keep in mind as we go through this contract here. You know, I had always found that negotiating when I was at private universities was a bit easier because we had a bit more flexibility with that. But at any rate, what you'll also want, and this is at the beginning of the contracting phase, is to make sure you have a properly routed and approved proposal in-house before the contract is negotiated. I am sure there are people on the line in this session, as well as many times in my experience, where you'll get a contract from another company, from an outside sponsor for faculty work, and then we'll get the sample contract, and then we'll go, wait a second, where is, you know, there's no proposal in the system. So that's another assumption for sponsored research agreements, is that you have already in-house a fully approved sponsored proposal. If you do not, I've generally, unless it is a high priority, time critical in a very serious sense, I generally would not want to negotiate a contract without a proposal in-house. So when you have this, for instance, a sample SRA in front of you, you already should have a proposal in-house routed through the appropriate chain of command at your institution. And at the top of the contract, where you can talk about the title or summary of the project, and that's in the yellow highlight near the top, that sort of information can be culled directly from the original proposal. If you are given a standard, but in the majority of situations, if you get a standard SRA from a sponsor or any other entity, and there is no proposal, I would hold off on negotiating the contract in a major way until the proposal has been routed. that is a best practice. So I always try and balance, and this is what contract negotiation is all about. It's balancing between what finding reasons to say yes, but also being true to what your institutional requirements are, and being a contract negotiator that takes best practices very seriously. So, assuming you have a proposal in-house, you get you can start work on a standard sponsored research agreement. You can start, getting down into the nitty-gritty here. So, Tamari, if you scroll down a little bit, I will, maybe to page 2, actually, because the bottom of page 1 is any flow downs or specialized provisions. Now, here on the second page, you have, clause 1.0 is self-evident. But the one point I do want to make up front, and this comes up later, and perhaps many on this session will know, is that when faculty or staff engage in sponsored research, they are, in a way, providing their best efforts on the project. We are generally not guaranteeing or providing a warranty on what the faculty do, and the faculty generally do not say, I guarantee this is going to be the result. So best efforts is a major concept in sponsored research, especially in relation to what the faculty are doing. And certainly if you're in a regular hard science research project, you may not know you probably won't know what the end result is until the research is done. I mean, that's part of what research is all about. But as much as you can, you should fill in clause 1.0, and this should be fairly easy stuff. And go from there. The clause 2.0, the term, this is an interesting topic, but I have come from the school of thought that sponsored research agreements should have defined start and end dates. I believe in clarity. I believe in certainty. Some contract negotiators do like to put in language that says this contract starts 30 days after the signing of the last signature on the agreement. Some may say the contract is effective for 2 years from the date of the last signature. And I can see a point in some of that, but if there's ever a question later on who signed the contract and whether they had authority to sign the contract, you land into a bigger gray area, and that would not be where I want to go. So that's why I've always, in my own negotiations and in the staff that I have worked with in sponsored research or contracting offices, is to get a start and defined end date for the project. I believe in clarity, and if wherever we can in these agreements to bring certainty and clarity, I'm all for that. Okay, you can scroll down a little. You'll see, certainly clause 3.0, which is faculty and equipment requirements. That stuff is very important. And once again, that material on facility and equipment should be in the statement of work, which is Appendix A, and which is at the end. And if you're in contract negotiation, you already know what a scope of work or a statement of work is. But once again, see, as I said earlier, the statement of work or the scope of work should be, if not directly cut and pasted from the proposal, it should be a very accurate summary of what is in the sponsored research proposal. I don't think it's necessary to attach the entire original proposal, but Appendix A needs to be 100% accurate to what the original proposal was all about. The payment clauses in Section 4, go to the root of what kind of a project you have, deliverables, and making sure that the financial aspect of the contract fits hand in glove with the work being done. Okay, so cost reimbursement contracts, which are the most common for universities, in many instances, you have sample language here. If you scroll down a little bit, we then have another type of contract, which is the fixed price agreement, which is tied directly from specific payment metrics to certain deliverable metrics. And so I think one of the best, one of the most important discussions, but the best value you can give to your faculty or staff that are engaged in this sort of work is to talk about, what are you providing? What sort of dates do you anticipate meeting certain deliverables? This is the important stuff. And if the faculty haven't thought about it that much, asking them to think about how they envision the project being executed. And once again, a lot of that should be in the proposal, but sometimes the proposals are pretty small, maybe written in a generic way, and there may not be specific timelines. And so, if you're working in the fixed price realm, it's critically important that you've had that detailed conversation with the faculty member where the requirements of the project are tied to when money is paid out, and how the university can get paid for the work that the faculty has done. So the fixed price agreements are very common when you get into the realm of industry work, and when work is often moving closer toward procurement. So keep that in mind as you move forward. I think, from my perspective, some of the most important questions you need to answer up front is, what is the term of the contract? What is the type of contract? And, since I believe in certainty, and if the contract is written clear, what I call a quality contract, there should be no question about a lot of this. And so, that dovetails with another long-standing idea that I've talked about in many of these sessions, is that it is important to think through the contract and to think through how it fits in with the project. And the more work that is done up front to answer all these questions, the less problem you should have at the back end. And I think for the contract negotiators online who have done this, for 5, 10, 20 years, that, more work done up front often leads to less work on the back end. And the cleanup of sloppily drafted contracts always takes more time than the extra time it would have taken up front. That's why I've told that, when I would talk to faculty about these issues, I would always say it's always better to spend a little more time talking with the faculty up front on all of these aspects than assuming. And that's a great value-added opportunity for contract negotiators to build good working relationships with their faculty. At some and I've worked at several, the faculty have had pretty dim views of contract negotiators because it takes too long to negotiate the contract. They're trying to get rid of every risk, when in fact, in many cases, you can't eliminate risk, but you can mitigate it to a very small possibility. And if through nuanced communication and your own behavior, you can say to them, look, we're here to support you. The contract and all these clauses are meant to protect you and your reputation, as well as the university's reputation. Most faculty would A, appreciate the honesty, and B, be a better partner with you and see that you are actually, skilled and you support them. So we can move on from this clause 4. Yep, let's go to this next page. I would say here, I don't have any comments highlighted for the report and inspections clause, but those are very important, both during the life of the project and at the end of the project when you have a final project report, final financial reports. I'm not, with no comments, that does not mean it's not important. It is. But once again, if you are being detail oriented, with the deliverables, with the term of the, the project start and end dates, with the deliverables, then you can easily map in on paper or in an Excel spreadsheet when reports are due. Now, certainly in many sponsored research proposals, that is all laid out already, but that's not uniformly the case. And make sure you pay special attention to this. Clause 6, which is confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure agreements. That's an interesting area because there's different schools of thought on whether you should have a separate NDA or CDA, or it should be, the language should be embedded into the sponsored research agreement. And here you will see in clause 6 standard confidentiality language. I've done it both ways, but what is important is that sometimes parties want to talk, your faculty member wants to talk to a private company that wants to fund his work. You will need a non-disclosure agreement before you even start talking in depth, because that is the sharing of confidential and proprietary information. And if you get that done first, the discussion leads to the talk of funded research, then it can lead to that proposal, then it can lead to the contract. And here then it would be simply easy to incorporate by reference into a clause 6 that this contract includes the non-disclosure agreement dated December 1st, 2025, and all of its provisions are incorporated herein. So that is very important. And in fact, many CDAs and non-disclosure agreements don't lead to funded research, because sometimes the parties talk and it leads to nothing. So, separate CDA, NDA is very important for that reason alone. And I think if you work at a university like UCF, for instance, or Northwestern, where I worked in my career, the big research universities, obviously there's established procedures and established templates in the non-disclosure realm. But the minute meetings are held and information is shared with a private company and your faculty member and they talk, then somewhere down the road trying to sign a CDA or an NDA, that does become problematic. So, when you talk to your faculty, always hammer home, you need a CDA or an NDA before you talk about anything involving confidential or proprietary information. One of the best things I like to do in my career was having forums or going to department meetings going to dean's council meetings and talking about these sort of things and reinforcing to the faculty that we're their partners, and the best way to protect them is bringing the contract negotiator into the process before you start talking about the important stuff, before the project information that involves confidential or proprietary information. And that is part of just the way I've handled contracts in my career. I don't think it is useful for contract negotiators to sit in their offices every week all year long and not get out to see faculty. I understand sometimes there's so many contracts that it's hard to get out into the academic units. But even if you can do 1 or 2 faculty visits a month, that's better than nothing. Word travels among the faculty units, the academics, and that I think is where you can add extra value. And that would lead to building up a better reputation among the faculty, which is something I've always been very much concerned about. So we can scroll down past confidentiality into publication, which of course, I think if there's any contract negotiators that have been doing this a long time on board, you know how important open publication policies are. You know, under US tax law with the IRS, it is very important that faculty have the ability to publish, because that is a major characterization of what being a nonprofit is. So, you know, there is nothing wrong with, you know, previewing a draft publication to make sure a company's proprietary or confidential information is being shared. But in the main, for most sponsored research, I'm not talking highly specialized security work, and that which is entirely a different, you know, session in itself. But in the main, nonprofit universities want to protect their status by ensuring that the faculty are publishing as much as possible. So we can scroll down. What you'll see here in clause 7 is some sample language on publication, and we can move on into the contract a little bit further. Now, clause 8.0, intellectual property and licensing. This is one of the troublesome areas in a sponsored research agreement. IP and licensing is one of the most problematic, well, troublesome clauses, as the FTP would call it. This is one of those areas where sometimes it's very hard for people to get together and agree on a, you know, on a project. And there are different schools of thought, and although this sample agreement here for you today, and which you'll get after this session, this does have IP and licensing paragraphs in it. Sometimes in reality, I would ask to start with to the faculty member, what do you see coming out of this? Do you see any intellectual property coming out of it? Generally, I'd mean patents, but it could be copyright also, other forms of IP. But in the main, we're talking about patentable material. And so I talked to the faculty, and, you know, and I'd say, well, what's the chance you would have patentable material coming from this scientific research? And while I sometimes ask them, you know, is it a 10% chance, is 5% chance, is it 0, is it 50%? What you're trying to do is get a good gauge of whether it is worth at this point to spend the extra time negotiating IP clauses within a standard sponsored research agreement. A lot of times, and this started in my years at Northwestern, we would agree to negotiate the IP language later when potentially licensable material came up, potentially patentable material. And in many cases, nothing ever did come up. but there would always be good faith language in the sponsored research agreement saying, if there is anything, any potentially patentable material results that come from the research, then the parties do need to talk, and an appropriate IP licensing agreement will be negotiated. And that licensing agreement would eventually incorporate by reference the sponsored research agreement, because SRAs generally fund, in most cases, basic research. And from there, you get the areas of, translating basic research into material going beyond that into the real world. So in many cases, it was always easier and quicker to negotiate the IP agreement later. Once again, it's a matter of practice, and maybe at your institution, your powers that be would like it all up front. And I've seen that too. But I'm trying, I've always tried to get the agreements signed as quick as possible to get the work going on. And if the IP language, if the project results in patentable material that needs to be disclosed and you need to negotiate later, then you do that then, because you're not slowing down the basic work. So that is what you talk about, a balancing of trying to get as much done as possible now for the faculty. And, and in many cases, when I look back at my career, in many cases, the judgments I made on whether we need to negotiate 8.0 now rather than later, that never came back to bite me or anyone else. And so I think, I don't want to say use your intuition, because this is considered thought. You need to give it, but, if the faculty says, well, probably in your very early stages, something may be created, well, then probably you need to do, add a section 8.0 into your contract, the standard sponsored research agreement. And also the last sentence I have here, also the creation of jointly owned IP will lead to additional management and financial costs. And you have to keep that in mind. And you also notice within my commentary here, the distinction between background IP and foreground IP. If the sponsored research project is incorporating prior created intellectual property in the research, then you do need to have a more fleshed out 8.0. Okay, foreground is what is created from the project. Background is what is brought into the project, whether it's your, whether it's, it depends what each party is bringing to the table. I just saw one comment pop up about perfect agreements and about compromise. I think most contracts are about compromise. I think if you want to build long-term collaboration with the other party, if you're doing international work, because I know we have international people, international institutions represented on this session today, it's very important to think of the long term. And that has always been my preference. There's certainly a role for one-off contracts, and there is no expectation of anything past that. But I think for most universities that are looking to build consistently and increasing amounts of sponsored research, as a contract negotiator, you always want to talk about what is the long run and how can we continue to grow and develop sponsored research. So these are all parts of that decision-making matrix, and is some of the most exciting areas of contracting that I have done in my career to date. So we can scroll down now past IP and licensing. Once again, you'll be getting a copy of this template afterward, and I'm certainly available to take emails at either email address, and I'll do my best to answer your queries. Clause 9, termination. Okay, you want a completely sealed contract, meaning every area should cover contingency, but termination is incredibly important. You have to make sure that you are covering any contingency. You do not want the other party to take advantage of gaps to exploit. In my university career, I would say that the other party exploiting a sloppily written contract was pretty rare. I think that's more common in the regular business world where you are looking at increasing profit. But I think among universities, that sort of shark mentality is not quite as common. But even so, the contract should be well written to cover every contingency and termination. And this is certainly in the cases, and we can scroll down from 9.2. This is certainly the case with another section we'll have here in a little bit called the force majeure clauses, which is acts of God. And that is very important because of the pandemic. And I've seen a lot of legal letters recently in my work about companies and subcontractors having to cancel contracts because of the pandemic and the disruptions in the supply chain, both in the United States and abroad. And that does lead, to saying, hey, we can't do this work because of the pandemic. We are invoking the force majeure clause. And if it's a delay, that's one thing, but that may need to be a termination also, depending upon the project. The pandemic, the COVID-19 is significant for these reasons. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But if you're negotiating contracts, the force majeure clauses used to be just the standard boilerplate stuff like, acts of God, unforeseeable events. Well, the pandemic is something we did not reasonably foresee, and it has had, as all major effects. So that's the purpose of having a tightly drawn, I'd like to say airtight contract. I'm not going to call them perfect contracts because they don't exist. People are not perfect. And, we all do our best, and the contract world has a lot of material out there and a lot of good people that are willing to share their experience. Clause 10 covers another important area. It's one of the troublesome areas, which is liability, indemnification, and warranty. If you work at public universities, oftentimes your Office of General Counsel or your system counsel will have already pre-approved certain clauses for sponsored research offices. For instance, if you work, like I worked in the University of Texas system, we always had suggested clauses and approaches from UT system. I'm sure the other systems have that. But certainly if you're in the public university realm, some of this is more tightly controlled. At the private universities, there's a bit more flexibility, but once again, you have to be very smart at what you're doing here. You don't want to indemnify another party for their acts or omissions, certainly not. That's common sense, and you don't need to be a lawyer for that. But oftentimes, mutual clauses are very important. In my experience, just a sec here. At any rate, I am back. I was talking behind the screen here. You know, back to the privates. The privates, you have more leeway to negotiate, but even then, the offices of general counsel have weighed in on suggested routes to go in this. And so, you know, some of that goes to a broader issue of how the sponsor research office or the tech transfer office interacts with the office of general counsel at your university. And that is the subject of an entirely different session because those working relationships are very complex. You know, sometimes the Office of General Counsel is very hands-off with regard to the sponsor research office. Sometimes they are very involved, shall we say, in what the contract negotiators in the sponsored research office are doing. So in some cases, I've heard of scenarios where the sponsored research office contract negotiators have to send the contracts to the Office of General Counsel for approval. That has led, in my experience, to real delays in getting contracts signed, which leads to A, faculty unhappiness, and B, it does, you know, kill in some instances faculty enthusiasm for sponsor research. But I would say that look at the culture at your university, look at the working relationship with the Office of General Counsel, and find that happy medium where both offices can work together in a very collegial and quick manner, so these contracts are done timely. So we can scroll down past clause 10, and we are down near the end. So we can scroll down here, please. One of the clause 11, publicity. I will just say very quickly, publicity clauses are very important when it comes to releasing reports of sponsor research activity. Your university may have an annual report, but then you may have sponsor agreements that say the funding that Foundation A gave to university cannot be disclosed in public, or it may be disclosed, but we have to approve it first. The language, you know, and so you know, publicity is important. It's increasingly important for universities because we're trying to get the word out there about all the good things universities are doing. So clause 11 is very important, and we can scroll down past that. Force majeure, here we go. That's what I was talking about earlier. I don't need to really hammer too much more. I'm happy to answer questions offline. But there is significant litigation in the United States presently based upon force majeure clauses in contracts, not even research administration contracts, just in many contracts, period. So keep an eye out for that. Export controls in section 13, well, you know, what's there to say? Export controls is a world unto itself. You know, I think, you know, I am not an expert in export controls. I am a generalist. I know just enough to be able to do the work effectively. If it's in contracts, getting the contract signed. This is certainly one of those areas where a lot of universities have regulatory compliance offices or export control offices, in which case the draft of the contract should be shared with the export control office just to make sure they don't have any concerns. And if you're in a collegial environment, it's very important for these offices to talk together on a daily or frequent basis. Of course, as I mentioned in this highlighted area, if there is no possibility that export control is applicable to a specific project, then I would remove it from the template SRA as you get down to negotiation. But that is a business decision, and that is something on a case-by-case basis. Okay, we can scroll down, and we're just about ready for questions? Nothing much to be said about notices, except make sure all of it's filled out. Because this could become important in cases of lack of timely delivery of deliverables, not being paid promptly, that sort of stuff. This section is all very important to have completely filled out, and we can scroll down from there. Section 15 in many contracts are numbered differently, talks about different areas of the contract. As I say in the highlights here, you'll see language on general principles of contract interpretation, the survivability of specific clauses, governing law, which is important. If you work in a public university in a state, in most of those states, you cannot accept the law of another entity. You can't accept the law of a foreign country. That's where you have to get into negotiating more specific language. The whole governing law area is important because that is driven oftentimes by guidance from general counsel at your institution. So keep that in mind. This is a catch-all area, and treat it that way. We can scroll down. All right, so this is the end of it. Obviously, the signature page, the attachments that you'd have here. Certainly A and B are the most common, you will see. D, very common too, because that's the prime award. Appendix C, which is the FAR and the defense FAR clauses or any other specialized terms and conditions, those would be added here. If you're doing work, doing federal procurement work, for those of you on the line, FAR and DFAR and other specialized agency terms and conditions are specialized areas in contracting. And so just be aware that should all be at the back end. The only issue I've ever seen with some of this in my career is that you're not getting all the complete documents. And I think if you get from the prime what appears to be incomplete documents, you always need to go back and make sure you get the rest of it. And so with that, we're done with the contract, and I'm happy to answer questions in the time remaining.
Thank you, James. I'll read the questions for you.
Okay.
We have our first question. What advice do you have to help expedite contract execution, especially for NIH grants involving clinical trials?
Well, I think well, the best practice I can share without getting more detail on specific projects is to do a lot of process engineering up front. Sometimes at institutions, the process for contracting or in clinical trials, for instance, are not very clear. When I started at one institution, and I will not name, but I negotiated clinical trials. And when I went there, I was told there were 4 months of clinical trial agreements that had backlogged. And, I had to dive in and start negotiating clinical trial agreements on an emergency basis. I think, clinical trials, it's even more important. Obviously, probably the questioner knows this. But with clinical trials, it's very important that these agreements be signed as soon as possible. And, those agreements cannot sit and wait. There's a lot of templates out there of clinical trial agreements, but I think a lot of the issues to get past delays in negotiating clinical trials has to do more with process, engineering, operations, creating culture of getting things done quick. That's my best answer without getting more detail from the person. So hope that helps.
James, our next question.
Yeah.
Can you explain again how publishing maintains the institution's nonprofit status?
Well, that's IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, in the regs. You know, when we're talking about nonprofit universities, okay, that is entirely separate from profit universities, such as University of Phoenix, RUC, and the like. Okay, nonprofit universities technically should not be making profit, and that's a whole different discussion itself. But one of the indicators of nonprofit, kind of like, you know, university property not being subject to property tax. That's tax-free. That's because there's a public policy that we support these entities. And so, you know, publishing is a way to give back to the public. And, you know, I think that is that was valid, you know, public policy 20 years ago or 50 years ago is valid today. But, you know, if universities are getting the money and they're doing the research, you know, there needs to be publishing of the results as a way to better society. And sometimes I think we forget about that this work is really meant to better all of us in maybe in an abstract way, but benefit the general welfare. Sometimes I think we're so focused on specific projects, we're not thinking that this is to benefit the general public. Of course, the other comment I would make is that people forget that if you receive money from external sponsors, it's other people's money. And, you know, like, you know, and so we have to do the work in accordance with the proposal and in the way the external sponsor wanted the money funded, wanted the project, you know, executed for that funding level. So it is all about OPM, other people's money. And, you know, and occasionally in a nice way, I'd always find a nice way to remind faculty that, you know, don't forget this is taxpayer money. And sometimes we forget about all that, but the money has to come from somewhere. And, you know, I think sometimes for all research administrators, for faculty and for universities, it's very useful to keep all that in the back of our minds. And when we work in reasonable and collegial ways with each other and with our external sponsors.
Okay, our next question, Jim, you addressed this a little bit during your presentation.
Yep.
Does having a perfect contract mean that one of the sides is sacrificing something?
Yeah, well, I don't know what the word, you know, is sacrifice a bad word? Is it a good word? You know, at the end of the day, as I said, there's no such thing as a perfect contract. If your goal in negotiating agreements is to make the other party feel like they're being taken advantage of, that's not going to get you too far. If you think this is a mutually beneficial way for each party to achieve its objectives, understanding that compromise is part of the deal, then I think that's a winner. And that's how you build long-term collaboration. You know, it's before I went into research administration, you know, one of the areas in law I worked in was in divorces. Well, you know, marriage is a contract, sponsored research agreements are contracts. In both scenarios, people have to compromise, right? And so I think the key is if you compromise and both parties feel like it's fair and it meets both parties' reasonable objectives, you've succeeded. I'm not going to say it's perfect because that's a straw characterization. But, if you're in sponsored research at a university, you should be, building collaboration for the future, which means you want happy partners. And that's where, having, good faculty producing work timely and of high quality is actually very important once you get past the contract. But compromise is a very good thing in sponsored research. And, I think that's even more important once we exit this pandemic era.
For our final question,
Okay.
if the prime agreement doesn't specifically identify which clauses to flow down to subrecipients, short of including the entire contract, how would you know which terms and conditions are mandatory to flow down?
Well, in the FAR world, there are certain mandatory clauses that do need to be flowed down, and that would be subject of another session. Outside of that realm, I think the first thing is you need to look at what the project work is. Okay, so once again, you refer to the sponsor research agreement. Then, if you're uncertain about what should be flowed down, you need to have a conversation with the contract negotiator or contracting officer at the prime and see what their opinion on it is. Now, if they say everything needs to be flowed down, my first step would be to take a look at what are these flow down clauses. And, one of the things you should not be when you're a contract negotiator is being shy. But certainly you can advocate for your position, and you should be able to make, talk about reasons why a clause maybe should not be included. If you're doing a project that has no defense research in it, no security, no export controls, any of the areas we considered highly classified or any of that, there is an argument that some of that is an overkill, because sometimes contracting officers, your other party, it may just be most convenient to say, well, everything applies. Well, I never quite bought that argument. But that's something I think the more you do it, the more you get a sense of. And if you're working with, and don't forget, if you're working with the same your contracting counterpart, if you're working with them on a consistent basis, you need to have a good working relationship with them. And that starts from the first contract you negotiate with them. If you get off on the wrong foot, sometimes it can be repaired, sometimes it's always going to be contentious. So, and the other business practice I always had was when I received contracts, maybe with what the question is dealing with, before I answer anything, I would acknowledge to the other party, I got the contract, thank you, we're going to review it and get back to you as soon as possible. But then I want to give it a good read before I go back to them with comments. And there is a lot to be said. Certainly now we're still in the pandemic era, and we're still doing Zoom and other virtual means. It is always preferable now that people are becoming very much more expert at this sort of communication, to have these sort of either the traditional phone call or these sort of calls to talk about this stuff. I was never one to say you should only negotiate by email and that's it, because many things can be misinterpreted on email. Tone, whether or not you intend it, can become an issue too, and that's why I say contract negotiation is part art and part science. There are the clauses, yes, and you need to know what needs to apply, yes, but how you relate to your counterpart, do you listen to them? Do you talk down to them? Do you actively listen in a meaningful way? These are the sort of intangibles that get many contracts across the finish line, and that's as important with international contracts as it is with contracts between U.S. entities. And tomorrow I'll be talking about global contracting, and that is one of the best practices. You know, I've done many contracts with colleagues overseas in many countries, and if anything, the importance of communication and nuance is more important in those contexts than sometimes with your regular American contracts. So keep that in mind, and if you're on tomorrow, you'll be hearing more about this in that session too. So that's it.
Any additional questions, Jim? How would they contact you?
Just contact me at either email address. I have both my private business email address on the tops of the PowerPoints. So one would be jcasey@caseyprivacycontracting.com. The other one is at my CUNY address in the MS in Research Administration and Compliance program, where I teach. That's james.casey@sps.cuny.edu. And I'll be happy to answer all your questions at either location.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Okay.
I want to thank the attendees. Our next